Today we're going to be talking about Benjamin Franklin and Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur. One of the questions that has haunted me since I moved to the United States decades ago was when every time I came to Morocco or go to Europe, people would ask me about America. What is America like? Is there really an American literature? Those kinds of questions. I mean, the kinds of questions probably, now that I look back, and I look back at the writings of Benjamin Franklin and Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, for example, you could see, some things haven't quite changed. There's still this kind of fascination with a continent and a country that is somewhat enigmatic, but at that time it was very different. It was a very different place. I was looking for ways to start this conversation, and I came across a statement by D.H. Lawrence when he was doing studies in classic American literature. He talked about he said, just I want to quote this to you. He said, Franklin, quote, Franklin is the real practical prototype of the American. Crèvecoeur is the emotional. To the European, the American is first and foremost a dollar fiend. We tend to forget the emotional heritage of Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur. End the quote. So here it kind of sums up his perception of what the difference between Benjamin Franklin and Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur, and as a way to get into a conversation. And I know. And before we discuss a little bit of his Benjamin Franklin's ideas, I don't know whether you remember that I came to visit you in Boston in the March of 2015, and you were very kind enough to give me, as usual, a wonderful tour, cultural and historical tour of the city. And we were standing by the statue. It was a rainy day, statue
Yes.
of Benjamin Franklin, and then you did an incredible presentation that I'm so glad to have kept. And I would like you to take a look at it right now. Here it is.
Okay. Boston's first statue of Benjamin Franklin. He was born about a block and a half from here, spent his boyhood in Boston, and then at the age of 16, ran away from home, went to Philadelphia, and really made Philadelphia into a city, bringing the values he had learned here in Boston. And the statue sits on the site of the public Latin school. Franklin was the youngest son of the family. His father was a soap boiler, and the family, they would make soap, sell soap and candles. They had 13 children, 7 sons, and the sons then were all apprenticed out to different trades, but Benjamin, being astonishingly bright, was sent to school. They came here to the Latin school, and in those days you entered school and you would sit in the back row, and as you advanced, you would move up. By the end of the first year, he was sitting in the front row. He was exceptionally bright. But then the family's fortunes took a downturn. They needed him to go to work, so that was the end of his formal education, about a year at the Latin school. So he doesn't go to college, doesn't go beyond, essentially, the 3rd grade. However, he becomes probably the most important American of the 18th century. After leaving school, he was apprenticed to his brother, a printer, and this scene shows young Benjamin as an apprentice at the New England Current, the printing office of James Franklin, about 2 blocks from where we're standing. So this statue was put up 150 years after Franklin's birth, has scenes from Franklin's private life. We'll go around to the back and we'll see Franklin's experiment with electricity in Philadelphia in the 1740s. Franklin, by the time he was in his 40s, had made a fortune, retired from business, sold the printing shop. He actually set up most of the other printers in America and had an annual income that today would be several $1 million a year. Devotes himself to electrical experiments. And here he is demonstrating that lightning and electricity are the same thing. Franklin also coined the term for where you store an electrical charge. He called it a battery. And the fact that some electrical charges attract and repel others, positive and negative, as he was one of the foremost men of science of the day, but then inevitably he is drawn into politics. And the sides of the statue show us other scenes in Franklin's life. Actually, before we get to that, When he goes to France in 1777 to try to bring the French into an alliance with America, Turgot, a French philosopher, coins this Latin motto. You know what the Latin motto says? Eripuit cello fulmen sceptrumque tyrannis. He sees lightning from the sky and the scepter from the tyrant. King Louis XVI wasn't really happy with someone seizing scepters from tyrants, so he actually had a chamber pot made for a lady of the French court who he thought was overly fond of Franklin, with this motto in it with Franklin's picture. So here we have Franklin in July of 1776. He's part of the committee that drafts the Declaration of Independence. So Franklin in the center, standing next to Jefferson. John Adams is on the ends. John Hancock, the president of the Congress, is there, sitting in the chair. And Franklin's main contribution to the Declaration was to simplify it. In fact, as Congress was debating the Declaration, Jefferson was really writhing under the fact that people were criticizing what he had written. And Franklin told him the story of a man named John Smith who decided to open a shop selling hats. Okay, so he had a sign made. John Smith, at this address, proposes to make hats and sell them for ready money. And he has on top a big hat. He shows it to a friend. First friend says, proposes to make hats and sell them. Are you going to do it or not? So I want to know, if you're going to, then tell me. So he takes out proposes to. So John Smith makes hats and sells them for ready money. Shows it to another friend. This friend says, makes hats and sells them. If I want to buy a hat, I want to know where to buy it. I don't want to know where it was made. So just tell me where I can buy the hat. So, okay, John Smith sells hats for ready money. Shows it to another friend. Says, no one else will sell you a hat on credit. People expect when they go to buy a hat, they need to pay for it. Okay, so John Smith sells hats. Shows it to another friend. Says, sells hats. Don't expect you're going to give them away. So then it just says, John Smith hats, until another friend says, you have a picture of a hat. You have the word hats, it's redundant. So finally, the sign is a hat, John Smith, and that's it. Franklin telling the story about how to write by simplifying, taking out unnecessary words. And then, of course, the final scene in Franklin's life, or at least his life here, 1783, he was one of the commissioners on behalf of the United States who got the British to agree to American independence. So we have Franklin, born the son of a soap boiler here in Boston, grows up to be one of the most respected, eminent men of the century, received at the court of France, helps draft the American Declaration of Independence, and here gets the British to agree to American independence. All begins here.
Now that we have seen this, your presentation, I think now we have a little bit of a historical background to help us make sense of Benjamin Franklin. And I was looking at my notes, and now we have come so far. I mean, we began with the sermons of John Winthrop and the William Bradford's Compact on the Mayflower and so on, and now we are beginning to see a different kind of approach, like in The Way to Wealth. I consider that Benjamin Franklin's The Way to Wealth as a new kind of sermon. A new kind of sermon of freedom. Would you agree with that kind of perspective?
Yes, yes. And the way to wealth, and like any sermon, Franklin and the guys of Poor Richard at the end says that the people, having heard it, immediately went and did the opposite. That is, Father Abraham in The Way to Wealth is exhorting them to not waste money and not to buy foolish things. And they're waiting for the marketplace to open. And then once the marketplace opens, everyone goes in to buy foolish things and waste money. And that was, so Franklin had a sense of how much people would listen to sermons. And so we do see a shift. And, bringing up D.H. Lawrence, he doesn't really like, in fact, he says, I don't like Franklin. And thinks that he sets up this dummy American who is all about dollars. And I think Franklin is really about something else in a way that Crèvecoeur is. And Crèvecoeur, again, he's a European aristocrat, which may suggest why Lawrence is fonder of him. He doesn't like the fact that in America you don't have this social hierarchy, social order, even though in a lot of his books he's railing against this stratified system. He doesn't like what the Americans are replacing it with. So, but anyway, getting back to your question about Franklin and the sermon, yes, it is something of a new idea, as Franklin is taking a lot of what he has imbibed from the Puritans and secularizing it. One of the most influential books Franklin says he ever read was Cotton Mather's book, Essays to Do Good. And he says this is what made him into a citizen, thinking about being a good citizen. He gets from this book. And yes. Mather wants us to do good as a way of glorifying God. Franklin wants us to do good as a way of being better people, and also recognizes that it helps, as he's getting ahead. And his autobiography and his way to wealth really are how-to guides as to how to succeed. And, success we can measure in all kinds of different ways. It's not simply monetary success. And I think one of the misnomers we have about the American dream is anyone can come to America and become rich, when that's really not it at all. Franklin talks about this mediocrity, that we don't have great fortunes and we don't have grinding poverty, the things that you did have in Europe in the 18th century. But instead, we have this kind of middle ground where, I was thinking, by the way, as I was rereading a lot of this in anticipation of our conversation about your story. I mean, you come here to basically study, and you become a college professor, and you raise 4 children here, and that's that is American success. No, you're not a titan of Wall Street, but you've had a successful life in the way that Franklin and Crèvecoeur would certainly have understood and applauded.
Yeah, you talked about mediocrity. He calls it a general happy mediocrity, which is a wonderful expression. I mean, it's like prevails. It prevails. This mediocrity prevails. At some point, we will see, by the end of our series, we will see whether that kind of happy mediocrity still prevails today, or a lot has changed since then. But he is, like you said, he seems to be like, he insists on good works. Good works are essential to him. But what is also noticeable to me, and what's noticeable is the kind of the religious fervor that we talked about in the previous episode, in the last episode, seems to have been completely diluted by now. I mean, in fact, I mean, you talked about Samuel, his what he told Samuel Mather, but I have here he told Ezra Stiles in 1790. He was telling him about that he believes in an abstract, broad notion of Christianity, but he doesn't see. But he also he told him, but really doing good is what matters most to him. So, but then he kind of was worried a little bit about having his views of Christianity kind of shared with the public. He wanted to be kind of discreet in that sense. He didn't want people to know the extent of his religious passion, whether he is a big believer or not.
I think part of the reason too is his sister was a very devout Congregationalist, and his sister Jane Meekum, who a younger sister, idolizes her older brother, and at one point she hears this rumor that he's an atheist. Franklin knew Cotton Mather and Increase Mather. Samuel Mather, whom you quoted, was Cotton Mather's son. And I don't think Franklin ever met him, but Samuel Mather writes to him in the 1780s. And so Franklin knew them very well. He also knew David Hume and Voltaire. So, as well as George Whitefield, the great evangelist, and all of them he gets along with. In fact, he publishes Whitefield's travel journals, which is actually a financial bonanza for Franklin to get that particular contract. So he's not a religious polemicist. And so part of it is anyone can look at Franklin and and think, okay, he's on my side. And Ezra Stiles, Congregationalist minister, becomes president of Yale, is actually writing to Franklin at the end of Franklin's life, wanting to inquire into Franklin's faith. And Franklin says, I'm at the age where soon enough I'm going to know one way or another. So why am I going to be worrying about it now? And in fact, he does die shortly after that exchange with Ezra Stiles, so he does know. But he writes to his sister, kind of trying to say that no, he's not, but he's not getting into a deep theological argument because that wasn't his style. But I think one thing that's happened over since the 17th century, which we were talking about last time, to the 18th century, is a tremendous migration of people from other parts of Europe who have different religious faiths, different religious values, and there actually are more congregants than there are ministers. So it's very difficult for a minister in any of the American colonies to get his congregation to adhere to the same religious strictures as would have been true in Germany or in England or Scotland or France, any of these other places. And if you are going to one church and you don't like the way the minister is preaching, you go to another one. And then the other thing, the big thing that happens is children of these folks start intermarrying. And that leads to kind of a formation of a not as strictly structured religious hierarchy. That is, a minister doesn't have time to catechize every child who is in the faith. And so you see a loosening of religious strictures. I think it was a German minister named Muhlenberg who says that I'd rather be a shepherd in Europe than a pastor here, because here in America, every member of the congregation thinks he is the minister's boss. And if he doesn't like what the minister is preaching, he will tell him, we'll go to another church, stop paying to support the church. And so it does put a certain different pressure on ministers, kind of not simply to exhort the followers not to sin and accuse them of sinning, but instead try to bring them in. It's a religious change that happens here. So by the 19th century, you have a minister like William Ellery Channing, a Boston minister who's considered one of the founders of Unitarianism, really talking we can't no longer can preach the angry God who is angry at you and you know why. Instead, it's a God of love who loves us all and wants us to do better. So that's the big change, and we can kind of see that happening in the era of Franklin. It's both a more rational religion, but also a friendlier religion. And it's friendlier for this reason that the ministers are under strictures from the congregations really are the ones calling the shots, not the church hierarchy.
Yeah, the essay that I would like to discuss with you is the information to those who would remove to America, which I think initially was published in 1782, I think, in England.
Somewhere in the 1780s.
Yeah, and he wrote to the Secretary of Congress, Charles Thomson, on March 9th, explaining to him as follows: I'm pestered continually with numbers of letters from people in different parts of Europe who would go to settle in America, but who manifest very extravagant expectations, such as I can by no means encourage, and who appear otherwise to be very improper persons. To save myself trouble, I have just printed some copies of the enclosed little piece, which I purpose to send hereafter to answers to such letters. And this was in the Founders Archives in Gov. And so, and he goes on, there is a sense in his writing, and that I think he shares that with Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur, which, as we shall see, right? I mean, there is a notion that the ideal immigrant, if you will, is an artisan, is somebody who is committed to working and doing the job and so on and so forth. And there is a repeated scorn of these aristocratic and cultures of Europe, and with the entitlements and so on, and their taste for the high culture. In fact, at some point he says those who like to have like high culture, those who are interested in those things in America should go to Europe, kind of thing, you know.
Yeah. And he also says that Americans don't ask who he is, but want to know what can he do.
Exactly.
There is a need for people who have skills to come.
Yes.
And they can develop them, but not the idea that you can come and be an aristocrat, knowing there's a lot of land. Well, I don't just go buy a huge tract of land and become a feudal lord the way perhaps I could in Europe. The land's all been divided up by this time. And Franklin says that's not going to be possible because of the way this society had evolved. In some places, there are large landed estates. In New York, for example, as well as in Virginia and South Carolina. And that is something that comes under challenge during the Revolutionary period. the idea of large land holdings. In fact, one of Thomas Jefferson's big accomplishments, he thought, was abolishing the rule of primogeniture in Virginia, where all the property goes to the eldest son. This is a way of breaking up this big property, dividing it up so that the next generation essentially can start over. So Franklin has definitely seized this and wants to discourage Europeans from coming over with this idea that I can simply go there and become a gentleman, which, by the way, had been something that had been a selling point for Virginia and other places back in the 17th century. And it no longer is here in the 18th century.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that, and it's always very useful, I find now at this stage in my life, that to reread things, classics, and not necessarily classic, in the context of the present. So
Yeah.
as I was reading that his letter, his essay on who is the best candidate to immigrate in LA, at one point he starts talking about tariffs, and and I would like to discuss this with you because tariffs now are in the news,
Yeah.
and especially in the United States, and
Immigration's
the
also in the
whole,
news.
yes. And so he says here that he says the buying up quantities of wool and flax with a design to employ spinners, weavers, etc., and form great establishments producing quantities of linen and woolen goods for sale has been several times attempted in different provinces. But those projects have generally failed, goods of equal value being imported cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
And when the government have been solicited to support such schemes by encouragement, uh, in money or by imposing duties on importation of such goods, it has been generally refused on this principle that if the country is ripe for the manufacture, it may be carried on by private persons to advantage, and if not, it is a folly to think of forcing nature.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, great establishments of manufacture require great numbers of poor to do the work for small wages. These poor are to be found in Europe, but will not be found in America till the lands are all taken up and cultivated, and the excessive people who cannot get land want employment. And then later on, he says, if the merchant demands too much profit on imported shoes, they buy of the shoemaker, the Americans. And if he asks too high a price, they take them of the merchant. Thus, the two professions are checks on each other. So he's not. So what he's saying, if a merchant, an importer, somebody imports items at a very high price, then the local manufacturer, who should be at an advantage if he sells them at a cheaper price. But so they keep a check on each other, kind of in a competitive way, which leads me to a question. Now, I'd like you to tell me what you think of this, because tariffs, at some point in American history, tariffs may have been useful. I mean, in shoring up the economy, but I don't know. I mean, did he read Adam Smith?
I'm sure he did.
Yes.
I mean, he knew Adam Smith. Adam Smith
Okay.
presented Franklin with a doctorate at St. Andrews. That's why he is Dr. Franklin. And there's a great dinner party that Franklin attended, along with David Hume, Adam Smith, William Robertson, who writes the history of Scotland. And Franklin and his son William attended this, and I think in 1759, 1760. And the accounts of the dinner are that Franklin said very little. The person the two people who spoke the most were Franklin's son and William Robertson. You think, gee, wouldn't David Hume, Adam Smith, Benjamin Franklin have had more to say? But in groups, they didn't speak a lot, which kind of belies what you and I are doing now. Anyway, yes, he had read Adam Smith. And what Adam Smith, and remember, Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations in 1776. This is when it is published. And this great book, which refutes the whole idea of mercantilism and the idea of tariffs, and free trade becomes one of the American ideals. Of course, it's something challenged a lot because there's also this desire to have protection. And Smith argues that, if free trade will actually increase the wealth of a nation as opposed to having a tariff that's going to protect your manufacturers, very much for the same idea that Franklin is having, that it's actually a restriction and the government interferes in this. So we see in the 19th century, there probably isn't a bigger political issue over the 19th century than tariffs, whether they are useful or whether they are harmful. And Jefferson and his administration are very much free traders, and virtually every presidential administration up to the Civil War follows that idea. On the other hand, a tariff can benefit certain folks. So, but anyway, yes, Franklin definitely had read Adam Smith and understood this argument, because it's not as though Smith is proposing something that would not have been thought of by someone like Franklin or other rational thinkers who see the state interfering in this. There's just another story I kind of like, because Alexander Hamilton does support tariffs, also wants to have the government getting involved in creating manufacturers. This is in the 1790s. Paterson, New Jersey, this great waterfall over the Passaic River, Hamilton sees it should be this big industrial city. Jefferson and others, agreeing with Franklin, says, we really don't need to have these manufacturers here because we don't have poor people we're trying to employ. In 1808, by the way, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury is Albert Gallatin, who is from Geneva. Franklin actually writes a letter of introduction to him when he comes to America, and Franklin had received a letter of introduction from Voltaire for this young guy from Switzerland who wants to go to America. And Gallatin does come to America and sets up a glassworks in Western Pennsylvania. Interesting political career, but in 1807, he's Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, and he has an anecdote in one of his reports in, 1807 or so, about this young woman in Wrentham, Massachusetts, who goes to Providence and sees a hat in a shop, a hat imported from Europe. And she says, I can make one of those. So she goes home and makes one. Then a friend of hers sees it and says, oh, could you make me one? So she makes one for her friend, and then the friend learns how to make them. And by the time Gallatin is writing the report, these young women making hats have a business. Young women in southeastern Massachusetts making hats have a business worth at that time about $100,000 a year. He sees this as really the model for economic development, not having the state of Massachusetts say, hey, why don't we set up a hat making business? We'll put a tariff on European hats, but instead having these ordinary young women simply making hats and selling them. And that way they become the entrepreneurs. So it really sets the entrepreneurial spirit that Crèvecoeur and Franklin and Adam Smith are writing about, against the idea that the state should be encouraging entrepreneurs with tariffs, with subsidies, with other things, because as Adam Smith and Franklin says, if they're doing that, if there's a need for a subsidy, is there really a need for the business?
Interesting. Yes. Interesting. Very interesting. So I think, yes, there's so much now about tariffs and everything else. Yeah. And also he talks about, people, he has a very low opinion of people who seek to get the public office. And, he says, those are like, shouldn't be lucrative, and they're not lucrative. And in fact, it goes against the principle of freedom. And, and so now that seems to have, also, in retrospect, now looking back, so much has changed since then.
Franklin proposed, by the way, at the Constitutional Convention that the president shouldn't be paid, saying, because ambition and avarice are the two driving forces in the human personality, and you can combine the two. And it was pointed out that if the president isn't paid, there are a lot of people, I don't know if you could afford, or I know I couldn't afford to do a job like that and not get compensated for it. You weed out a certain number of people. And the other, it's an idealistic idea that, it'll be someone who serves basically the public interest. And Washington, as commander of the Continental Army, didn't take a salary, and that becomes kind of a model. He does have his expenses covered. And then when he becomes president and he suggests simply having his expenses covered, Congress remembered what his expenses had been during the war and said, no, we'll give you a salary instead. President Trump, by the way, doesn't take his salary, and other presidents have not. Yes. Herbert Hoover didn't take a salary because they thought, I'm doing this as a public service. And, again, yes, you were in a different position. We don't need the income. We do need the income in they perhaps didn't.
Yeah, and so I mean, we're now going to diverge a little bit and talk about this notion of public service. I jokingly I used to uh, tell my friends, and they'd be horrified in Maine and everything. And then when I told them that one of my favorite politicians is Jesse Ventura, Jesse,
Yeah.
but
We can
Jesse
see why they'd be
Ventura was
horrified.
became governor of
Yeah, yeah,
Minnesota,
yeah.
and he once during one press conference, and some journalist asked him a question, and he said, "I need to keep my day job," which was a wrestler. He
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
wrestler,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so he understood instinctively or not, or maybe politically, ideologically, better the notion of public service than a lot of professional politicians.
Right. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Should it be a profession? That's really a question, and I don't think that was in Franklin's mind. I mean, he does serve. He said he never sought an office. He never turned down an office, and that was the disinterested ideal in the 18th century. That it would be someone who takes a turn at this. H.L. Mencken, 20th century journalist, said we should actually choose legislators the way we choose jurors. That is, you get a notice in the mail that you're due for jury duty, and so you go and you serve on a trial. And he said jurors are very serious about what they do. They want to get it right, but they don't want to waste any time. They don't hang around thinking, boy, what other cases can we decide? So they go home. So you get a notice saying you're a member of the legislature. So you and 100 other people will show up and determine what needs to be done and then go home. I mean, I'm not necessarily advocating that, but it's certainly something to think about. The notion of public service and doing jury duty is both a public service you're doing, but it's also very important constitutional protection, knowing that the case isn't going to be decided by a judge, but simply by 12 other people who can certainly understand what another person might be facing. So that's really one of the cruxes here of creating this system that Franklin's very much involved in, a system which won't replicate the hierarchical structure or stratified structure of Europe.
Yeah, which raises a question now with an extensive court system in the United States and the I don't know, maybe millions of cases. I mean, now the last I read a few years ago that the most cases don't go to trial. Most they always there's always a settlement. So the system is no longer capable of offering those, as you said, these constitutional protections to every American citizen.
Well, it's capable of it. And by the way, one reason we're told when we go to jury duty, even if we are not called, the fact that there is a jury ready to hear the case often leads to a settlement, which
Yeah.
might have happened before. It's really a subject for another day. What happens when the 1960s with the extension of the guarantee to counsel at any trial does allow anyone who's arrested for anything to have a lawyer, which of course it's a constitutional protection. It leads to fewer cases simply being determined by pleading guilty. So there are fewer guilty pleas, which is one reason there are more trials now. But then again, as you said, more settlements, because do you really want to count on being able to convince these 12 jurors that your side is right? That's really one of the issues we have. Is we have a constitutional system created in the 18th century which does lay out certain guarantees and a certain structure, which ultimately does protect lots of civil liberties, other things. But we always have the argument, is the system now too complicated? Is the country too complicated? I don't think so. I think the fundamental principles are the same. The idea of a separation of powers and the idea of, we can talk about the constitutional structure some other time. Franklin is at the Constitutional Convention and has lots of very wise things to say. And again, he wrote the Pennsylvania Constitution, and he cites it in his essay that forbids an office from becoming too profitable. If it is, something needs to be done about it. Because you shouldn't. I had a friend who actually was a professional politician, and he said, "You run for office because you want to do a job, not because you want to have a job."
Interesting. That's well said. That's interesting. Well, this is a great segue into the crève-cœur. And there's quite a few overlap. But I think I think in some sense, D.H. Lawrence's description of the two people, or the two men, it's a little bit apropos, because what the crève-cœur does, what Jean Crève does, is like he humanizes, or gives like more of an anthropological uh, view of American society, maybe an ethnographic view of the
Hmm.
culture, the people, their behaviors, and so on and so forth. Um, and he does call Americans a promiscuous breed. I
Hmm.
love that
Yeah.
kind of expression. And he calls the country the Great American Asylum, which is a term that would later be used in a different context, right? As
Yeah.
a
It
and
really is true. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Again, Franklin had written a similar thing on his essay on population, talking about how the American
Yes.
population was doubling every 20 or 25 years. And this is going against this idea that had prevailed that if people leave a country and go to another, the country they're leaving from's population will decrease. And he says, well, actually, the population of England had grown in this time. And the Americans, Franklin, I think, uses the word prolific as opposed to promiscuous. That is, the population rises, and it seemed like the resources were inexhaustible. When Jefferson took office, he talked about room for our descendants to the thousandth and thousandth generation. And by the way, at this time, he's talking about a country that ended at the Mississippi River. So there is this idea that this can continue. And Jefferson is refuting the ideas of people like, the British economist who writes Thomas Malthus about, ultimately population will outstrip the ability to feed it. And Malthus had looked at India and seen this happening, but Jefferson thinks it's impossible in America. So there is this idea. And again, we have people in America marrying younger than they did in Europe. This is in the 18th century, having more children than they did in Europe because it's a more productive society. So you have this capability. Of course, it also means your children aren't going to hang around where you are, but are going to have to move to other new land and take it up. And this is something that Americans continue to celebrate into the 19th century. Emerson's essay on self-reliance, he talks about this people who try different things and this motion. So Franklin and Crève-cœur both certainly see this. And Crève-cœur, of course, had come from France, winds up going back to France, but sees this new thing happening in America. It is interesting that, D.H. Lawrence looks a little more favorably on his take on it than on Franklin, whom he thinks is, as I said, he doesn't like Franklin, but
Yeah. Franklin is he's almost he's almost too perfect for a lot of people. I mean,
yeah,
that's what
that's it. And I
that's
think that comes from his autobiography, where he is
yes,
creating this perfect character. Even the things
yes,
he does wrong, he says, oh, they're errata, they're minor things that could be corrected
yes.
in a later edition. And yeah, and he was tough. I
Which is
mean,
a humanistic,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
quite humanistic, and really,
yeah,
uh, it's a secular. I mean, if you now knowing about how he feels about religion as a whole,
yeah.
and in his other writings, when he talks about Native Americans, for example,
Hmm.
and how
Yeah,
in their wisdom,
yeah,
and as you know, I mean, he was an abolitionist
yeah,
till the end
yeah.
of his life. So he had, if you look at everything, it was not just like some accountant, like counting the assets and liabilities of what
Yeah.
of America, but he really wanted. I mean, despite his tone and despite his style, to me, I mean,
Hmm.
he sounds like, if you combine all of his writing again. And
Hmm.
I just read that piece when that Swedish minister was trying to teach Native Americans about the apple,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then and then the Native Americans listened very solemnly, and then at the end they told their own myth of
Right.
creation,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
the Swedish minister got upset and said, "No, that's not in
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not in the
yeah.
Bible," or something like that.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, it does have this sense. You take him and all, and at the Constitutional Convention, he's both very optimistic but also very pessimistic about things, saying that
Yes.
this will work as long as the people are virtuous, and after that, they may
Yes.
need a despotism. That is, he
Yes.
understands human nature and human failings. And so, Lawrence pillories him as trying to set up this dummy American, this automaton, which I think isn't really what he was doing. And he begins writing his memoir really for the benefit of his children, who only knew him as a successful man. His son had grown up with his father, who was one of the most successful people in Philadelphia, and then his daughter only knew him. So he writes this book about his early life when he grew up very poor, as a way of showing them that he wasn't
Yeah.
always this figure they knew. And then he talks about how he tried to achieve moral perfection, but he fails at that, as anyone would. And he does this in this kind of tongue-in-cheek way, pointing out the last virtue he has is humility, because people, after he had his first 12 virtues, someone says, what people really think about you, they think is you're a little kind of a braggart. And so he says, oh, humility. And he has imitate Jesus and Socrates. That's how you become humble, by imitating the Son of God and the wisest man who ever lived. Just think about that as how
Yes.
you achieve humility. But then he said, had he achieved it, he probably would have been proud of his humility. So he recognizes his imperfections, even as he's not emphasizing them in his memoir. And it's really only by understanding the imperfection of human nature could he have um, understood or thought about how to overcome it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's what he has in common. What I found looking at Crèvecoeur, he also Crèvecoeur talks about America being the American as being a new man uh, whose religion demands very little of him. I mean, and
Yeah,
then at some point he mentions that the phrase there is a religious indifference prevails in.
yeah,
So
um,
once this promiscuous breed kind of
mhm,
expand, maybe he accepts in New England. I think he does. New England is a
yeah,
separate case,
yeah.
but
It's an interesting thing because there was in the middle of the 18th century this great religious revival. And then there's another one in the 19th century. And it's not tied to a certain denomination. I think that's one of the new things here. Um, but then again, there's a growing laxness toward religious matters that you see in the 18th and 19th century. Um, James Madison comments in the 1820s, I think it is, that New England, which had been so pious, now is becoming much looser. The Unitarians had split off from the Congregationalists, but in Virginia, which of course had been where Jefferson wrote the separation of church and state, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, that was becoming more pious. That is, in New England, you did have a state religion, but by the early 19th century, that had pretty much fallen apart. Virginia, with no state religion, people are becoming more religious. That's, I guess, one of the real, I don't want to call it necessarily a dilemma, just one of these factors. Where does it come from? And it's a difficult thing to measure religiosity. Is it church attendance? Is it something else? And Franklin writes about this in his autobiography. There's a minister, Jedediah Andrews, who's a Presbyterian minister, and Franklin was nominally a Presbyterian. And he says that he contributed to the church. And he said he even went 5 Sundays in a row, even though Sunday morning was the one time he had for doing his scientific inquiries. And then the minister persuades him to come back, and the minister takes a point of the scriptures saying that if there's anything good, true, or honest, look upon these things. And Franklin thinks, finally, from something like that, we're going to need to get some just morality. But instead, the minister looks at this stricture as come to the Presbyterian meeting house and don't go to any of the others and follow the rituals of the church. That is, looking at this as a very narrow thing. And Franklin says, no, if you're not going to get any morality, as he calls it, out of that passage, you're not going to get it anywhere else. So he stopped going. That is, Franklin wants a certain thing out of this, which is to make good citizens. And he thought Reverend Andrews was not trying to make good citizens. He was trying to make good Presbyterians.
yeah. So and Crèvecoeur also maybe New England being an exception to this promiscuous breed, and he has high regard. At some point in his text, he kind of seems to be grateful to the powers of the East. I think by that he meant England, right? England was he was
I
still
think so.
a
Yeah.
very appreciated. America to him was English America in some
Yeah,
ways.
because he had come over actually with the French army during
Yes,
the Seven Years' War. So he had fought with
yes,
Montcalm at Quebec, and then he stays after the French lose and gets a farm in New York, and he marries. His wife
yes.
is a New Yorker. Her family remains loyal to the British Crown,
Mhm.
and she dies in an Indian attack during the war. He is away. He's off in France, I think, and comes back. His two children. He talks in the book in the letters about how his children have become fat and frolicsome. This is when he's writing back about what a great place it is. But then he's leaves, and in the meantime, their place is attacked by Indians. They wind up in Boston. Complicated story with Crevecoeur, but he is writing in this way. It's not completely celebratory, and in fact, I understand some of the letters weren't printed in the book, which comes out, close to the time, because they were more critical of American society and the way things were going in the war. So it's not just one untrammeled pursuit of perfection, but there are reasons you might fail in this new world.
Yeah, in this population scheme, in this text, we for New England, let's say they're the gentleman settlers, if you will. They're
Hmm.
the sophisticated settlers, and then as you go further inland, you're in the middle. In the middle, you'll find some good, hardworking farmers and
Yeah,
doing it right, and then you have the frontier, the
yeah,
settler,
oh yeah,
the and those are the back settlers of the great woods, what I that kind of Wild West, and those are like then the population becomes at that point, heavily degraded, but
oh
worse than the
yes,
Native Americans.
yeah,
And despite the perception, so he but also at the same time that recognizes I'm a big fan of Sergio Leone, the Italian filmmaker
hmm,
who's famous for making spaghetti
yeah,
westerns,
right, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. The
once he
good, the
was
bad, and
asked
the ugly.
why he
Yeah,
makes these movies, he said,
yeah,
"America. These are the people who made America. They were uncomplicated, uh, uh, basically men,
yeah, yeah.
detached."
Yeah.
So, and he's kind of like a conquistador kind of idea.
Hmm.
And so he says, he who would wish to see America in its proper light and have a true idea of its feeble beginnings and barbarous rudiments must visit our extended line of frontiers,
Hmm.
where the lost settlers dwell and where he may see the first labors of settlement. So New England is not a good prototype for people, not a good example for people to understand how America began, so to speak.
Right.
Now that
Yeah.
100 years, 200 years after the fact, maybe it's better to go to the frontier and see how things began,
Yeah.
but not
Yeah.
quite, because the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the Puritans were different people.
They were. You also, by the way, do see a lot of New Englanders pushing into the frontier in places like, upstate New York, with land taken from the Iroquois during the war, and then into Ohio and Indiana. There's a New England influence there, even as you're on this frontier, which similar to the frontier they've been on in 1620, where 1630, where they're having to contend with this wilderness as well as with the native population. And so you see, it's an impossibility of simply recreating any kind of world that had been in England or in Europe at the time. And that is this democratization that happens along the frontier. No, they're not going to be building opera houses. Ultimately, they will. And whether that's a sign of, I don't know, the breaking down of this entrepreneurial spirit or not, um, yeah, there's a great book that Frances Trollope, who's an English writer, writes about America in the 1830s, and she absolutely hates America and Americans. Sees them as all just rude and uncultured, and has a whole chapter on how difficult it is to find servants in Cincinnati. And they'll pay these girls more than they'll earn by working in a factory, but they don't want to be servants, and she just can't understand that. One girl is in tears when she learns she can't sit and have dinner with the family because they don't think she's as good as they are because she's a servant. In the 1760s or 1770s, a member of parliament reports that he had knocked on a door in Boston. A servant answered, and he said, "I've come to see your master." And this young woman said, "I have no master but Jesus Christ." And the thinking is, how do you govern these people if everyone thinks he or she is just as good as everyone else? But it is that spirit that is making this society. And it is a problem. How do you govern these people where everyone's just as good as anyone else? And what kind of social hierarchy can there be?
Yes. These settlers in the Carolinas and Virginia, they descend into outright lawlessness. And so he mentions the Sioux
Yeah.
areas. Uh, the other thing is that the irony. He's a little ironic, right? I find, and he James, the fictional character he uses. He tells his wife he likes to write that when he describes himself as a scribbling farmer, and his wife warns him not to write, because she's worried about the perceptions. People might see him as idle and vain, and so the occupation of writing for a farmer was somewhat a little bit. Unsafe, so to speak. It's not befitting a farmer to write and philosophize, if you wish, because
but he
they have
does
no
write. Mrs. Trollope's son, Anthony Trollope, becomes one of the great novelists of 19th century England, and about 30 years after his mother. By the way, the mother's book makes their family successful. They had been really struggling until she writes this book trashing America. And so her son, who becomes a successful novelist, then visits America in the 1860s, and he comes out of the opera house in New York, and he sees a line of cabs, and every cab driver is reading a newspaper. He says, that would be unheard of in England. Why would a cab driver want to read a newspaper? What business do they have with what's in a newspaper? But here in America, everyone does have a business. His mother thought that was a terrible idea, to have everyone invested in this political system. Her son kind of sees, well, actually, there's something to this. So scribbling for a farmer may be seen as idleness. On the other hand, farming doesn't really pay a whole lot. Writing a book that's being sold in Paris certainly does.
Yeah. Also, I think what's beautiful about Crèvecoeur. He shares the same antipathy to slavery, and he's horrified by Southern slavery and the way the slaves are being treated, because it goes against the ethos of the hard work and what that's expected of So it's a.
It is the great contradiction in America, with this ideal of equality and this ideal of liberty and the institution of slavery. I mean, how do you reconcile these things? It's something, of course, American society has been wrestling with, and scholars have been wrestling with.
Yeah. So and then, of course, at the end, he has to leave, as you said, and he calls the country was convulsed with chaos and civil war. He begins to realize the danger of opposing prevailing sentiments, and the wars basically do not serve the people. He says, the wars always create class division and exploitation, and he calls England that great nation which convulses the world.
That's it. Yeah. Of course, he's French too. So.
Yeah. But I don't know. My feeling. I don't. I didn't do a lot on Crèvecoeur, but it doesn't seem to be enthusiastic about the revolution.
No, not at all. And his wife's family all go into exile because they're loyal to the crown. And so it does divide people. I think we have later acquired this idea that everyone was agreed. And of course, if we were there, we would have been on the right side of this. But this is a choice people are making. And then there are folks like, Thomas Hutchinson, who knew Franklin, and others who remain loyal to the crown and go into, as Franklin's own son remains loyal to the crown and becomes the leader of the loyalists, as they're then known. And so it divides people. And I have to say, Franklin, in his autobiography, never quite gets to the revolution, this great divisive moment. And Crèvecoeur also really, because how do you write about this war that is dividing people? And if everyone who was here when he starts writing in the 1770s they're suddenly on opposite sides. Well, how then do you explain that they had this cohesive culture that everyone
Mm.
shared? And that's one of the great conundrums of this whole period, is how do we explain the institution of slavery and the fact that then this society, which Krevker is seeing as, one big happy family, becomes so bitterly divided.
Yeah, talk about Franklin. He wrote a piece on how an empire loses its possessions,
Yeah, yeah,
and beginning from he uses the metaphor of a cake, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
people, it's that it starts from at the edges,
Yes,
from the
yes,
edges, and that's a wonderful piece that could be like added like some sort of addendum to the Declaration of Independence, so to speak.
yeah,
Which is
yeah.
like more of a legal, more of a cultural argument. It's like basically berating, uh, as to some extent, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, right? And the King of England for having mismanaged the
That's
situation.
interesting you picked that up, because he wrote that, how to turn an great empire into a small one. At the same
Yes,
time, he wrote another piece on an edict of the King of Prussia. And he was
yes,
really surprised that the edict of the King of Prussia sold much better than how to turn a great empire into a small one, which he thought was the better piece. And it has a
yes,
more sophisticated argument.
yeah.
And so it kind of surprised him. But yeah, he is always seeing through this, or seeing the possibilities of failure in things, which is one of the things that continues to make Franklin fascinating.
Yeah, what I find also interesting in Crèvecoeur, in the sketches
Hmm.
of the 18th century America, which was published later,
Yeah.
and he begins like his tone changes. It becomes more like, and I wish we had time to talk about Alexis de Tocqueville.
Hmm.
Uh, Basically, more of an portrait of Americans in different occupations, in their ways of life, and so on. And he begins to say they have an exceptional interest in property.
Hmm.
Uh, Again, the notion of being indifferent to religion comes
Yeah.
up, and they're solitary, self-reliant, self-made. That's why they're litigious, because they have this sense of fairness.
Right.
But the law is also severe,
Hmm.
and in the letters of an American farmer, but in the end, he also goes to the frontier, and
Yeah.
he abandons his the farm and everything else, and to
Yeah.
go lives among Native Americans. The only condition being that he's not allowing his children to marry the natives.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there are limits. There's a great line in one of Bob Dylan's songs about, I'm liberal, but to a degree. I want everybody to
Yeah.
be free. But if you think I'd let Barry Goldwater move in next door and marry my daughter, you must be crazy.
Yeah. So there is this kind of this tempo, if you will, to this text, like great enthusiasm, great
Hmm.
place. This is a remaking of the world, so to speak.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
America as a new
Yeah. Yeah.
humanity, where humanity is remade anew. And of course, I'm struck because of the Statue of Liberty. Here when he talks about America's message to the foreigners who from any part of Europe when they become citizen. And so America tells them basically, "Welcome to my shores, distressed European. Bless the hour in which thou didst see my verdant fields, my fair navigable rivers,
Hmm.
and my green mountains. If thou wilt work, I have bread for thee. If thou wilt be honest, sober, and industrious, I have greater rewards to confer on thee, ease and independence." And
Hmm.
so on. It goes on like that. It's like almost like a precursor to the Statue of
Oh, yeah.
Liberty's
Yeah.
inscription.
It is. Yeah, it's give me, you're tired, you're poor. But it's not with the idea
Yes,
that they're going to be, now you're poor to take care of. Their idea is they will regenerate themselves. And that's
yes,
been a persistent idea. You think about what Thomas Paine says in Common Sense, that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And by the way, it was the idea behind one of the colonies that didn't work out as well as its proprietors hoped. That is Georgia. Georgia was started as a place where debtors from England could come and start over. And Franklin thinks it's not a very good idea, because what happens is the debtors come to Georgia and they look across the river and see in South Carolina all the work's actually being done by enslaved people. So why don't we have slaves? And the proprietors say, absolutely not. You can't have slaves, because that goes against the whole idea of why you're trying to regenerate yourself. They say, well, can't we regenerate ourselves with slave labor? And ultimately, the proprietors give in on this. And then Franklin really becomes cognizant of this when George Whitefield, the evangelist, goes to Georgia. He was friends with Oglethorpe and others of the philanthropists in England behind this. And Whitefield's real mission is to build an orphanage for the children of these debtors who had come over and died. And Franklin says, well, what you're going to be doing is simply replicating their life as, basically broken debtors. And instead, why don't you bring the children to Philadelphia and put them to work, where they'll learn trades and things. And that's not an idea that's going to go over. And anyway, just to get to the end of this particular story, Bethesda, the orphanage that Whitefield starts, by the 1750s, it's being run with slave labor. So you have the perpetuation of this idea. The mission is to help these folks regenerate themselves, but very quickly, the people supposedly regenerating themselves think it would be easier for us to do this with the labor of others. And Franklin sees that as anathema to everything. So you have this tension here, but this idea that you come here and Creveker makes it sound as though they just walk off the boat and become Americans. It makes it a magical thing. Both he and Franklin are really arguing for something else that requires, this effort. And Franklin makes it clear in his information for those who would remove that you're not going to come here looking for a handout. That is, you have to make it on your own, and the mediocrity is what you can achieve.
Or maybe, this leads me to, I wonder, now because we live in the 21st century, we think of immigration as, we still think of the United States as a land of opportunity, and we go to improve our law to make our lives better and everything else. But the idea today people have of immigration is opportunity very often includes looking for a job, a stable job, people, but in the 18th century, it looks like, or the 17th, 18th century, so on, the idea going to America was not really immigration as we understand it today. It's more like a different kind of, they're going to build a place from scratch. It wasn't like I'm going to work in a company or going to work in a university, but you have to go there to be a pioneer. You have to be a pioneer the best qualification you can have is to have a pioneer in mind. So something like that, to be a farmer, so to speak, to start a farm and do everything basically from scratch with almost no help from the government.
Yeah, and I think we do see a certain degree of that with some immigrants today. I'm thinking particularly of people I've known who come over, they work as house cleaners or as landscapers, but their children then are doing, and by the way, some of them then are running a business doing this.
Yeah.
And they see a niche they can fit into. Why so many Koreans have laundries, or, because it's not because Korea is filled with laundries, but because this is a niche that we can fill.
Yeah.
In Boston at one time, a lot of people from Ethiopia ran parking lots. And it wasn't because Ethiopia is a place where they know this was a niche. And then their children then go to school, and their children then become part of this culture. So that's kind of still the idea that you come over not knowing, hey, I'm going to go to America and I have a parking lot, but I'm going to go to America and then see what the opportunities are.
That's right.
And so that was, I think, part of this idea that does tie back to this 18th century idea of immigration, that you come over and it's not for you as much as it is for your children and grandchildren. It does harken back to what Emerson wrote in the Concord Hymn about these heroes who dared to die and leave their children free. That is, you're achieving this mediocrity so that then your children can do this and their children can do this. So it's really looking toward the future in the same way that Franklin and Creveker both were, as Creveker's writing about his children in this new land.
Right.
And
the farm, once you own a farm, the idea is you kind of leave it to your children and it grows and so on. And this reminds me of that passage in Information to Those Who Would Remove, about when he talks about, I think in something like indentured servants, people who come over from Europe and they're
Yeah.
They end up they work for somebody for a number of years, but there is a law that governs that kind of relationship. It has to be signed by a magistrate,
Yeah.
and the idea is after a certain period of time that the person has the apprentice is to learn all the
Yeah.
trade,
Yeah.
and then move on and be his own master, so to speak.
Yes. 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 That's true. It was typically 7 years, and this is someone would pay your
7 years.
passage to the new world, and then you'd
Yes.
work for work for 7 years, and then you would become free. And in the meantime, you're supposed to be learning this. Similar to the idea of an apprenticeship that
Yes.
had been really the norm. And remember, Franklin had been apprenticed to his brother to become a printer. And when he
Yeah.
dies, he leaves this fund to train apprentices, to give low interest loans to young tradesmen who had just been released from apprenticeship. And
Yeah.
that will help them set up in business. So you have that idea. And Franklin points out that that's really no longer happening, that whole idea, there aren't these indentures being handed out anymore. So
Yes.
by the time he's writing that in the 1780s, that kind of way of bringing in a workforce wasn't really happening so much.
Yeah.
And but it had been the model. And in some cases, it's really quite exploitative. In Virginia, for example, until the late 1600s, most of the people brought over as indentured servants. After 7 years, you're free, you get 50 acres of land. They die within 2 years. So then the 50 acres they were supposed to get goes to the person who brought them over. So that's a way for some people to increase their holdings, those who are fortunate enough to survive the first few years in Virginia. And but on the other hand, it was a way of bringing in a workforce. But by this time, by
Yes.
the time of the 1780s, when Franklin is writing, it's really immigration is working in other ways.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating in that piece when he says we already have 9 colleges and universities
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
arts and so on. But no, I like the piece because it's really governed by. It seems to be the relationship between. He doesn't talk about indentured servants, but people who want to learn a trade, and the
yeah,
master is supposed to teach them how to read and write and educate them.
yeah,
Basically,
yeah,
there was an obligation, a legal obligation on the master that that I found that fascinating. That basically you come to the United, even though you don't have the means to have your own property, your own farm. There are ways you can learn
yeah,
and get into business. Now the expectation, I think the industrial revolution, basically, which has created a new the poor that they both bemoan, he and Crèvecoeur in Europe, which end up working for the rich or for the
yeah,
aristocrats or otherwise become like outlaws of some kind because the European elites have no place for them, and there's
hmm
so much competition and resentment. The artisans, the craftsmen, don't want to teach people who
yeah,
might end up being their rivals,
right,
and
right, yeah.
so. But I think the Industrial Revolution changed that dynamic and
It definitely
created a
did.
whole
Yeah,
new class of working class people.
yeah, it definitely did. And again, in America, we've liked to say that we don't have a class system. It's not as stratified as it is in Europe. Um, but you do see a change with industrialization. And how likely
Yes,
is it that someone starting off on the shop floor is going to become the owner of the company? And because there are many fewer owners of companies, particularly with the
yes,
consolidation of industries and so on. On the other hand, there are people who do, like I'm thinking of, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick. They don't start off with this high echelon, but they make it there. But
yeah,
the system does change and makes it more difficult for that kind of advancement. But then we're thinking about something different, because remember, Franklin and Crèvecoeur are both talking about this happy mediocrity, when that's certainly not what John D. Rockefeller or Elon Musk is necessarily enjoying.
yes. Well, Bob, thank you so much again.
We
This is a great session. We're approaching now to the Revolutionary
Yes,
era with Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. So
okay,
those will be our next episodes.
very good.
And thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Anwar. It's great to talk to you.